You never played the Mendelssohn at the beginning of your career as a child. It was Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, but the Mendelssohn wasn't thought so highly of in that time. Is that correct?
It was, however, the first concerto I studied. One of my very first lessons with Persinger, he asked me to prepare the first page, you know, until the tutti. And that was what I did when I was about 5. Then it was very useful to me because with that, the second and third movement, I won the one and only prize I ever got in San Francisco.
Now, this is the earliest film. In fact, is it the only film recording you've made of the Mendelssohn?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
The filming itself, how long did it take? Was it an arduous process?
I think, no, I think it took about 3 days. I think we did the Mendelssohn concerto in one day or one afternoon. I think we just sort of played it through, you know.
Now, you are very, very familiar with recording studios. You had been already since 1928, yes, as you reminded me, and also with radio studios. But now, was the film studio a totally different kind of discipline?
Yes, I don't think, unfortunately, as far as I remember, we didn't take full advantage of the fact that they were Hollywood studios. I think the decor was almost non-existent. There was perhaps a backdrop or something. I do remember that in the pieces with piano, there was a fake window behind us.
I wanted to ask you whether it was a real window or not. It's fake.
I think it was fake.
As you could see out to a park.
Yeah, I think the palm was fake too, but the music wasn't.
Looking at the film, it appears like a recital, and we're lucky in the audience to be able to sit in the room with you. But was it a very complicated mechanical process? Did you record the sound first? Tell us how it worked.
I just played and they recorded and filmed. There was no playing to a playback of the film at all. I generally find that rather difficult.
To mime to your own performance.
Sometimes for the sake of the film, we have done it simply to have a better visual angle or quality, something which you couldn't do while playing, sort of a camera between your fingers or up your elbow or up your sleeve or something like that, or under the piano.
But not in Hollywood in 1948?
No, not in 48. Unfortunately, really, because the film part, the visual part, is the weaker part of the two.
Well, do you think it's important to be visually interesting?
Well, I think if you go in for it at all, you might as well do it well, because otherwise you are caught with looking in a way that the eye itself doesn't look. I mean, the eye doesn't stay on one spot at one angle. The eye moves around, so that I don't think it is really wrong. If you are doing the visual as well, you might as well give angles which the eye wouldn't normally find and make it interesting.
And this is what Paul Gordon did with a camera over the head of your performance, so that he looks down on you and behind you.
So he did use some artifice.
Yes.
I'm glad.
I think he had more than one camera. I don't know. Can I ask you for a moment to try to put back in your memory to 1948 and be in that studio? Do you see more than one camera in front of you?
Yes.
2 or 3
I think
cameras?
the musicians, especially the orchestra musicians, were too expensive. You had to have at least 2 or 3 cameras. You couldn't ask them to play it more than once or twice, you see. So I'm sure you're right. I think there were several cameras.
I noticed in the film that you had a very high action. Your elbow and your right arm were nearly always up higher than
I think I had too high right elbow. I don't think that was particularly good. I think that the flow of energy wasn't as smooth as it might have been. There I worked also quite a lot in later years, but the left hand was, I think, something I actually accomplished, which I was content with.
Were the filming conditions an inhibition for you? Were you in some way cowed from your normal total freedom of performance? Do you feel that sometimes you look a little bit as if you are having to contain yourself? Perhaps the cameraman has said, don't move too much because you'll move out of focus or something like that.
Maybe I don't recall that especially, although, as you say, it was a special situation when playing with lights. That would have been what would have irritated me most. But after all, I was playing music with people I loved and music I enjoyed. I don't think I was particularly inhibited, but I just remember the fun of it and the unusual adventure, because I'd never done that before. There may have been some shots taken informally, you know, in the course of my previous years of career and perhaps in the army, but this kind of situation had not occurred. It was long before, as I say, television kept on intruding into music. And Dorati was in a genial mood, and we always had fun together. He was my greatest colleague for at least a half century. We met on the ship going out to Australia in 1940, I think, 40 or 41, and became great pals, musical, and his wife was charming, Clara, and we remained very close during the war and in Dallas. In fact, I got him his first job in Dallas, and then he moved to Minneapolis and to where we remained very close, and to Detroit and to Washington. Those were his 4 important American posts, and I was always stayed with him wherever in these 4 cities. Not only were they musical friends and good friends, but they were close to me during a difficult time of my life when my marriage was breaking up and so on.
So it was not, in fact, more than a few weeks after your second marriage that you made this film.
That's right.
So that Dorati was there in a sense to celebrate your new happiness.
More or less. And it was a delightful occasion. We didn't really do much more than just play. I mean, perform.
I mean, you didn't need to rehearse very much.
No, we didn't rehearse, no. And with Barlow the same way. We'd been playing these pieces throughout the war. There was no matter of rehearsal.
One more word, though, about Antal Dorati. To accompany a concerto like the Mendelssohn, he is one of the most difficult jobs for a conductor, isn't it? Because
well, it depends how erratic the soloist is. And I try to be free without being erratic. And I think we had played it already together. I felt quite at ease and quite at home. And I'm sure he enjoyed it too.
Now let us talk about your pianist, your accompanist, your partner. You've had many great accompanists in your life, including your dear and alas no longer with us sister. But Barlow was one of the longest serving of your partners. Tell us about him.
Adolf Barlow was the most gentle of men you could imagine. He was a wonderful musician, a wonderful pianist, thoroughbred in as far as style and classical music was concerned.
Looks a little bit older than you, was he?
I suppose a little bit older, must have been.
And Polish by birth?
He was born in Poland, Jewish, and studied with Leschetizky in Vienna, with whom Diana's mother studied as well. And when the Nazis came in, they quite deliberately, knowing he was a pianist, I think they asked him if he was a pianist, and proceeded to break his fingers. And then he found a wonderful doctor in Vienna who was able to restore the use of the hands. And I met him in New York, looking for a job, with his dear wife, Edith, a darling couple. And he played so beautifully. I mean, I'd rarely had, since Balsam, a pianist of that caliber, a great, great pianist.
Didn't he tour with you for the military concerts?
He did all the concerts I did during the war, and went with me everywhere, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Aleutian Islands. He suffered many of the consequences of those exploits. I remember in Arizona once taking 2 horses. We're not horsemen, either of us, but it was really very funny. It would have made the subject of a comic film, certainly. But anyway, in the Aleutians, where it's cold and windy, as everyone knows, we were lodged in Adak at, respectively, the general in charge and the chaplain.
You were staying with the general in charge?
I was staying with the general, and had the advantage of an actual loo as part of the house. But the chaplain only had an outhouse. And exactly as in Charlie Chaplin's film, a gust of wind blew it off Adolf. And he was no worse for it, but it was rather an adventure that is not likely to happen often in people's lives.
Now, let me ask you about Charlie Chaplin, because he must have been a bit of a hero of yours.
He was.
Such a coincidence that you were filming a concert in the Charlie Chaplin studio.
Yes.
Tell us about Charlie Chaplin and what he meant to you.
Well, of course, I knew him from the Gold Rush, which I think must have been done before, and his wonderful walking away into the distance, a touching, tragic, humorous, wonderful, wonderful character. I loved him.
Did he turn up at the film studios when you were making the concert?
No, he wasn't there.
But you carried his photograph when you were a young man all
I
around.
did. When this was actually on the occasion of the first concert of the first tour I ever did, beginning in San Francisco and Los Angeles in the fall, autumn of 1928. And we were in Los Angeles for the concert, I think at that time, in the Masonic Auditorium, which seats 5,000 people. And as it was the right thing to visit Hollywood, someone had arranged that I should visit the set on which Charlie Chaplin was doing City Lights. And there was a great fountain built in whatever material, cardboard they used, and there's a picture of Charlie Chaplin of me in front of the fountain. I did admire him, and I felt he was a man of such real human quality, and I admired him.
Isn't it to put an idea in your head, perhaps because, like him, you reached out to people across languages, because Charlie Chaplin was an international figure?
Yes, that's true. That may be, but it may be that subconsciously I felt that there was a model, in a way, that didn't depend necessarily on words, depended on music and mime, and of course, at that time I hadn't realized the background of Charlie Chaplin in the music hall, the British ancient, wonderful institution of the music hall. My mother had taken me once a year to the Pantages, which is a theater in San Francisco, where a sort of touring company came every year with the vaudeville. In other words, ballet, which I love, jugglers, singers, and a violinist by the name of Caricchiarto.
Never heard of him.
Caricchiarto played the violin jolly well, and remained with this vaudeville, touring vaudeville company year after year. I must have heard him 3 or 4 times in San Francisco on their annual
when you were really small?
tour. I was, well, that time I was already playing the violin, I think 5 or 6 or 7, 8.
So
and he impressed me a great deal. He played beautiful, warm, you know, sentimental, romantic pieces, and was quite brilliant too.
But is it fanciful to think that you were in some way destined by your mother particularly to perform, and it might have been in a theatre, you might have been an actor rather than a musician?
That I doubt, that I doubt. I don't think I've ever had acting gifts, nor had my parents. Diana, of course, has huge acting gifts, but I had none at all. In fact, I find it even difficult to say anything that I'm not convinced of a natural, you know.
May I take you back to Berlin, which was a city that obviously was interested in your work because they had the first German screening. And this was a city which you'd had a special relationship with, Berlin, I think, for many, many years.
Yes, I have, and it still is patently alive. Of course, my debut in Berlin was quite an event. It launched me in Germany immediately, having performed with Bruno Walter and the reception, all the people who were at that Mayflower concert, we call it.
You call the Mayflower people, but why do you call it that?
Because I've met more people than could have possibly fitted into the hall who claimed to have been at that debut. But it was a remarkable audience, composed of very, very cultivated people, and composers and violinists, musicians, and the whole musical establishment of Berlin, which is quite considerable.
And you played Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven. Not a bad little program.
That's a little program, yes. If I had known Bartok, I probably would have added another B. And then, of course, that continued until the Hitler-Nazi period. And I returned to Germany after the war, and for concerts, displaced people's camps, concentration camps, and benefit concerts, and played in Berlin again. And they will never forget the fact that as a Jew, I returned immediately after the war to bring them really what belonged to them and to all of us and to the world, which is the great music of the German composers and other music too. And so that is something that also has remained over more than, well, some 50 years. It continues to accompany me wherever I go to Germany. People still cannot get over the fact that I had come back with Diana, and she was behind me in these. And I've always felt that it was the right thing to do. And as it turns out now, the more one sees of the world, the more right it was to have done it at that time.
As an historian, as your biographer, I noticed that, in fact, it was immediately after your visit to Berlin and when you had this very serious contretemps with the Jewish displaced persons,
yes,
who resented the fact
That's
that you
right.
played to Germans. And then you went straight back from Germany to Alma in California, to Los Gatos, your home, and
Yes.
made these films that we were talking about. Now you made the concert.
Yes, that's
Within a
true.
few days of being in Berlin, squaring up to Jews who
Yes.
protested their hatred
Yes,
of you to
yes.
begin with. How did you overcome the Jewish attacks on you?
Well, you know, they were not all that, how shall I say, lethal. They felt hurt, they felt they didn't understand it. And then when I did go to Israel shortly afterwards, they realized that I was anything but a traitor or a, you know, they understood. even though they couldn't quite swallow it perhaps, but they understood. They allowed me to be that way and gave me their support and their love and their friendship. It wasn't that, it was the focus of that occurred in that camp and even there, when I came the next day, insisted on coming back and facing the man, also club-footed like Goebbels. Jonas was his name, I think.
This was the leader of the
leader of that movement. Yes.
The ones who criticized.
And I came with an awfully nice Jewish officer who was entirely sympathetic to me, and they said, well, please come and play for us. We'd love to welcome you. And so it's just a measure of the very illustrative example of how people can be led, how a single person can play upon a group's fears, prejudices, experiences, bring them back to life, and appear to lead the whole group. And he does. And yet, that group can be turned within a quarter of an hour to a perfectly reasonable group. That's why I lay so much blame on the heads of people like Milosevic and others and all these tyrants and despots and many others who deliberately will make their own career out of the sufferings and fears and worries of a people and ride high by simply saying, you know, you are not to blame, follow me, as the others are hideous and we'll wreak vengeance on them and so on. It's all part of vengeance, which is one of the lowest forms of human expression, and nothing more terrible than what is called righteous vengeance. And so, and with people, you can even awaken it with the second and third generations of people who haven't suffered themselves. Yes. It's possible. If they have any grievance, it's like a little wound. If you have a scratch, there's an army of bacteria that are waiting to make the most of it. And if you have a healthy body, you'll cure. But if you have someone who comes and knows that it's a little itch and starts really scratching it properly and getting it infected, that's the role of these mobsters, of these people who lead people who are frustrated or sad.
I'd like to take you back to the mood of the 1940s and just ask for a moment, when you got back to America after the war, when you went to live in California with your new wife and so on, what was the mood like in America, so far away physically from the troubles in Germany and other countries, the whole atmosphere, almost perhaps isolationism returning to American politics for a time?
Well, it wasn't returning that quickly. There was, first of all, the natural euphoria of having won a war. And I remember one of the greatest sights I've ever seen, and even though I'm not inclined to be chauvinistic or nationalistic or anything like that, but I must confess that it was a moving sight when I saw from a balcony of a beautiful house, the Ehrman's house in San Francisco, overlooking from a great height the San Francisco Bay, and saw the Pacific Fleet steaming in. Soldiers lining the...
and you were a good American then?
Well, no, I was naturally. I was glad the war was over, but there was something about a general feeling of... I'd seen them in Honolulu, I'd seen them coming back, ambulances bumper to bumper.
With wounded.
And played in the hospitals and so on. So it was a real feeling of relief, but it was more than that, because there was a certain grandeur about the sight. It was a wonderful sight.
I right to think that in some way the optimism, the immediate post-war optimism in the world, is in some way responsible for Paul Gordon and yourself deciding to have this very optimistic idea that you'll take music into the farthest quarters of the world, to villages and towns where you've never played? Was it all part of the same optimism?
Well, I think you're right up to a point.
Yes, you're sceptical enough to think I'm probably wrong.
Yes. I think that we were certainly living on a high, as it were, hoping for the best. But it was nothing to compare with the optimism that marked the end of the First World War. This had left too many open questions, and the advent of new elements, including the Orient, and new forms of human behavior that were hardly believable. Certainly, the First World War was a carnage which should have never taken place, but there was still the flag and the nationalism and the church, but we were opening into an unknown era where landmarks and values and directions were going to change. There was already a great feeling of that. It wasn't to last forever. And although there were enormous developments in science and commercial exploitation and the idea of gradually the global concept, a global awareness, which was both hopeful and frightening, because people were not accustomed, especially in America, to think in those terms. Whether I can ascribe any degree of idealism to the making of these films, yes. I mean, they might become very popular and people would look at them, but it really was much more the opportunity of doing something which was a new approach and perhaps a new distribution. It was probably too early for its time.
Don't you think there's something special about listening to music in the company of others? Being
I
part
agree.
of a group as opposed to just sitting at home?
I agree. I think you're perfectly right. Something which Glenn Gould would have died rather than to have admitted. But it's a collective feeling. Any really moving collective feeling is something which is part of a species. We don't only live as individuals, we live as groups of individuals. And perhaps that is something which is taking a rather negative form today.
Do you think it was perhaps too much to hope for in the film, that you aren't there in person, you're up on the screen in celluloid, and yet the public is sitting, maybe hundreds, maybe 1,000, sitting watching one piece after another? Perhaps there was something a bit too artificial about that for it to have a long life or have many subsequent films.
I think it would have to be a greater work of art, both visually and, what else, to command an audience, to hold them in rapture, shall we say. I don't think these films can actually pretend to such compelling power.
And yet at the same time, I'm sure you're glad you made them.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, even though I know that audiences react collectively, and it's a wonderful sensation to know that you've carried an audience, as you've carried an orchestra, and that the exuberance has communicated itself to the whole audience. It's a wonderful feeling. I mean, just recently after the 9th in Berlin and so on and so forth, these are wonderful feelings, but in the final analysis, you're also, the musician is playing for himself. And the audience doesn't necessarily understand the criteria which determine a performance. They're there, they think it's very good. If it is very good, and there is absolutely no way of denying that it's good, even the least instructed of an audience will know that it's good, will come along.
I'm glad you said that you play for yourself, because in a way, watching the films, you feel that you are in some kind of a trance. When you're playing, yes, you appear to be completely outside the world.
Yes. Well, it's true. Perhaps even more so than I would be if I were playing for an audience, because I'm not aware of the few or many audiences who are going to see this film. I'm not playing for them actually. I may be able to construct a scene which I'm not given to, you know, people sitting in their drawing room or in a little theater or so. It reminds me of that very sentimental touch of the film that was made of various American artists at the beginning of the war, when America entered. Stage Canteen, it was called. You remember, I played the Ave Maria on there, and it ends up with a soldier with his girlfriend holding hands. But I'm afraid I don't conjure that kind of a vision when I'm playing. It's totally different. I'm thinking of the music and what it feels without crystallizing it into an actual human situation.
I'll never forget you telling me you used to sing yourself to sleep with Tchaikovsky's melancholic serenade.
Right.
But as a good Jewish boy, which you obviously were in those days, wouldn't the second movement of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto have come close as something to sing? Doesn't it have also a tremendous heart?
Not really. It's much more, how shall I say, much more civilized, objective, cultivated. The Sonate Melancholique is really how shall I say?
A cri de coeur, perhaps.
It's not only crying, a sobbing sort of thing. And that appealed to me at the time. I seemed to imagine that that was what I shared with the world, that sadness.
May I put the question differently?
Yes.
The Germans in the Nazi era banned Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto. Astonishing decision. Is it, in your mind, a particularly Jewish piece?
Oh, no. The Mendelssohn Concerto is not particularly Jewish at all. It is particularly Mendelssohn, with that wonderful gift of flowing melody, the genial composer who never had to stop to search or look or wonder where he was going. I mean, that is the facility with which he wrote, was the facility of a very great talent, an enormous talent that had composed like Mozart since he was a boy. But I don't think of Mendelssohn as a Jewish composer at all. And as far as the Sonate Melancholique, it's not Jewish, it's Russian. But nonetheless, Russians and Jews have all suffered the same way in the same place.
Now, would you, if you could, make this film again now, where you're still playing the fiddle regularly, would you have another go at it? Would you like to?
Well, I haven't played really seriously for a long time, and there are so many wonderful violinists today, some of whom I actually feel have a sense of style, which isn't generally the case. I wouldn't mind conducting them in these works, and yes.
Film producers, please note. Yehudi, thank you for giving us so much time today.
I enjoyed it. I always do talking with you.